Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Anesthesia Grand Rounds. This is our annual Global Health edition. So thanks for joining. Thanks for braving the rain for those who are here in person, and thanks for joining online. This morning, we've got several great talks lined up over two thematic project areas. I'll be introducing the first, and then we'll take a little break in between the two as we set up for the second. So without and one quick reminder, the DEI Journal Club is going to be on Thursday, January 5th at 5 via Zoom. So please keep an eye out for the email invitation for that. So without further ado, the first project that we're going to be hearing about this morning is the Open Oximetry project. Dr. Greg Leeb is going to be starting off by introducing the background of the project, and then you'll hear from several other team members, including Dr. Carolyn Hendrickson, Isabella, Auchus, and Caroline Hughes from our team. Greg, for those of you who have not met, Greg is the CHESA Fellow for this year. He's an Australian-trained anesthesiologist. He has an interest in not only global health, but also pediatric anesthesia, recently completed a fellowship in pediatric anesthesia in South Africa, and has a wealth of experience that he's brought to the team. And so we look forward to welcoming him and hearing about the Open Oximetry project this morning. Thanks, Greg.
Cool. Good morning. Great to be here today. And thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Cheers to those who braved the wild weather to get over here, and g'day to all those at home. So I'm going to give a brief overview of how and why the Open Oximetry project was started and highlight the areas we're working in to obtain our objectives. And then I'll hand over to some of my colleagues to discuss a few of the current studies we're undergoing and very excited about. So this is our team. We'll hear from some that are able to join today, but it's much greater than those that could be present. It encompasses clinicians, public health professionals, physicians, physicists, engineers, and clinical research coordinators. It spans over multiple countries, including colleagues in Uganda and other institutions. This work is possible due to our funders, Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, USAID, STAR, CERSI, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And this is a collaborative project between the UCSF Hypoxia Lab and CHESA. So you're going to hear about a lot of different activities and areas of research today, but I just want to really highlight this is an amazing team effort. So CHESA is committed to addressing inequities in healthcare globally, and these definitely exist in pulse oximetry. And there are three major areas. And the first is access, and this has always been the big problem. So here are just a few relevant statistics highlighting the issues surrounding access to pulse oximetry. So there's greater than 30 million surgeries performed without pulse oximetry yearly. 70 to 100,000 ORs and ICU beds worldwide do not have pulse oximetry. And pulse ox is not routinely available in primary care settings in low to middle income countries. So getting these devices into the hands of those who need them is a huge part of the problem, but it's not the only one. And there are also really important questions surrounding performance in the devices being used. So how do these devices perform in different settings and with different populations? And how does device performance affect outcomes for patients globally? So the issues surrounding performance are not new. We can take a quick look at the timeline of them. So in the late 80s and early 90s, several papers were published showing the biased skin pigmentation introduced into pulse oximetry. So these graphs are from a paper in Chest, published in 1990. And the graph on the left shows the spread of results for SpO2 versus SaO2 in white patients, and that on the right shows the spread of results in black patients. And we can see that there's a far wider spread in the black patients. And the study showed there was far less accuracy in black patients, and also a frequent overestimation of the true SaO2 value. And here at the Hypoxia Lab, Severinghouse and his team were also already starting to make some of these observations. So in the 2000s, the Hypoxia Lab published several papers on this topic, and they really showed the effect of skin pigmentation on pulse oximetry accuracy. And they also highlighted the effect of low saturation on this bias. And we can see quite clearly in these graphs, the figure showing bias on the y-axis and variation on the of the SaO2 on the x-axis, that divergent bias between dark skin pigmentation population and light skin pigmentation as we decrease in SATs. So the effect of skin pigmentation on pulse oximeter performance has long been on the radar of regulatory agencies, even though prior responses have been mixed and inadequate. This is a draft guidance from 2007 in the wake of those various papers on the issues. And this draft guidance shows a recommendation to change the amount of subjects with dark skin pigmentation from an unspecified amount to 30%. And this remained a draft guidance only until the 2013 guidance that was put in place 6 years later. So just to highlight a couple of issues on this, the amount of subjects with dark skin pigmentation required in a device is at least 2 or 15% of the subject pool. And that is half of that which was initially drafted 6 years before. Another major issue here is that there's no definition or recommended measurement tool for what constitutes a darkly pigmented subject. So I think this leaves, firstly, a lot of room for interpretation for companies and also very inadequate diversity. So sticking with the timeline, in 2020, Schoeding published this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was a retrospective study involving 10,000 pairs of measures of SpO2 to SaO2 in patients. And Schoeding found that Black patients had nearly 3 times the frequency of occult hypoxemia that was not detected by pulse oximetry compared to white patients. And this was the largest study from the clinical setting that demonstrated this concerning bias. So this is a question I've heard asked, and we have heard asked many times in several different ways. How does 2 or 3% SpO2 difference make a clinical difference? And this is a question that's come up a lot in the wake of Schoeding's paper and been looked at in further papers. And they showed that not only the bias, but for the first time, the link between health and healthcare disparities in the real world. This is an area of real growth in research. So in the past 2 years, there's been more papers published on this than in the past 2 decades. Overall, studies showed racial and ethnic discrepancy in pulse oximetry, leading to longer wait times to supplemental oxygen treatment and delay or omission of treatment of things like corticosteroids, and amongst other outcomes. So this is a table from Kelvin Moore's editorial piece highlighting numerous treatments dictated solely based on SpO2 levels. And we're often giving therapies based on an absolute SpO2 cutoff, and I think COVID really highlighted this to us. And it's easy to see that using absolute cutoffs, how disparities in care can exist. You know, you get a patient that comes in with SATs of less than 90%, and they get steroids and get admitted, versus a patient that comes in with SATs of, say, 92%, and they could get sent home with no treatment. So I think this really highlights how bias in pulse oximetry can affect care in this setting. Another major impetus for starting the Open Oximetry project was requests like this from NGOs. So in the midst of COVID, we started seeing large-scale donations for pulse oximeters, and multiple large donors started asking us about performance of devices. So the Open Oximetry project is really a culmination of these years of work in the hypoxia lab in Cheshire. And through it, we hope to characterize magnitude and the root causes of this bias, improve regulatory standards of these devices, and ensure access to reliable data for all. And I'll briefly walk through how we set about doing this. So a major component of our research is clinical studies. And as you'll hear more about briefly, the FDA have approached us to conduct a prospective clinical study to help understand the magnitude and underlying reasons why pulse ox bias exists in a real-world setting. And we also tie this in with lab studies. So we conduct weekly lab studies in the hypoxia lab to firstly assess and evaluate the most common pulse oximeters used globally, with an emphasis on those that are donated or procured for LMICs. And we also develop and test new protocols that better predict real-world performance. So these 2 graphs on the right are highlighted by Dr. Bhumi Okunlola, who was a former Cheshire Fellow. So the graph on the left shows some laboratory findings, and then the graph on the right is from the Clinimark labs, and then the graph on the right is from Schoeding's paper. And you can see there's quite a discrepancy in those findings from the laboratory setting and the real-world setting. And we want to understand why that is. And we will use the same devices and protocols in our lab and clinical studies to better define what is causing that. And you'll hear more about this from our colleagues this morning. We're also developing new techniques, and one of our objectives is to standardize the way skin pigment is defined for the purpose of resource. There are many techniques for measuring skin color, and this is not standardized, which leads to a lot of challenges surrounding this research. On the right, we can see just some of the scales being used, and we're incorporating these into our studies. We're also utilizing spectrophotometry to try and understand how we can better standardize the objective quantification of skin color for this research. And we're publishing all of our protocols, and these protocols are open for discussion and commentary to improve them as well. We've also developed raw PPG devices and creating novel approaches for their use. We're working with the FDA and ISO to provide input on and test new regulatory frameworks based on our clinical studies to improve safety while also improving equity and access. And to that end, it's important to note that exclusive focus on performance can have unintended harms, and this can really drive up the cost of devices, and we're really aware of that, with marginal performance gains. And this could translate to further limiting the access to poor communities. So we're excited to work with our partners to bring this voice to the table. We're creating a completely open data source from all of our studies and publishing this on our website for anyone to use and review. And we also share all our protocols, and these are all open for commentary. Collaboration is central to the project, and the Collaborators Forum has 100 participants involving key stakeholders from industry, regulatory bodies, and aid agencies. And as I've said, there's a lot of active research in this field from many different avenues. It makes sense to collaborate and work together. And it's been a good process to work with people from many different backgrounds on this shared goal. We also plan to utilise CHESS's status as a WHO collaborating centre to strengthen this partnership with the WHO on this topic. And this is just to highlight another component of the Open Oximetry project in the works. So this is led by Dr. Bumi Okunlola. We're creating a toolkit to help researchers ensure adequate diversity in research, particularly where there is potential to create or perpetuate health disparities. So we look forward to sharing more about this topic with Bumi in future grand rounds. Thanks for your time. I'd like to invite Carolyn Hughes to discuss the ECOC study.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hughes, and I'm a clinical research coordinator with the ECOC study, which is currently based out of Zuckerberg SF General. I'm presenting here today with Carolyn Hendrickson, who is a PI for the study and also the site lead. And we would also like to mention some of our collaborators with the study who are not here to present today, but contributed greatly to the project in our picture below. Before discussing our study, we would like to mention some of the limitations and discuss them from prior clinical studies. Dr. Leeb mentioned the Schoeding and colleagues paper, which was the largest clinical study published to date, looking at skin pigmentation and how that might affect pulse oximetry bias. A limitation of this study was its design. It was a retrospective analysis, and they had SaO2 values from the arterial blood gas samples, but they did not know the exact moment that those samples were drawn. So they were retrospectively trying to go back and find the saturations at the exact moment of the arterial blood gas. They were able to narrow that down to a 10-minute window, but as we know in the clinical setting, saturations can fluctuate greatly across the span of 10 minutes, and there was no accounting for the stability of that saturation. Patients in these studies were also categorized by their self-reported race as a measure of their skin pigmentation, and race can very much, skin pigmentation can vary greatly across racial categories, so this was not a very exact measurement. And furthermore, there was no consensus on an exact way to measure skin pigmentation accurately in these types of studies. With these limitations in mind, the FDA approached our team hoping to fund a prospective clinical study. We would like to shout out Kelvin Moore, who is a second-year medical student with UCSF, who used his research summer to really launch this study and get it off the ground at Zuckerberg SF General. We feel our study is unique because we have study personnel present at the bedside to simultaneously collect the exact time that an arterial blood gas is collected and measure the exact pulse ox saturation as well as perfusion index in that moment. We also are collecting both subjective skin pigmentation measurements using skin pigment scales as well as objective skin pigment characterizations using colorimeters pictured in the bottom right, which can measure things such as melanin index and erythema index. Our study uses multiple devices. We look at the Philips standard of care monitor, as well as 2 affordable pulse oximeter devices, which are commonly used in low and middle income countries, the Contact and the Masimo Rad-G, pictured below. And we are proud to be harmonizing with multiple studies, such as the Stanford pediatric study, which is very similar to our own, and multiple disciplines to try to make sure we are harmonizing and collecting the best data possible. A quick look at a snapshot of the data that we've been collecting. The key data points that we are focusing on and collecting in the moment, as I've said, are SpO2 and perfusion index in the exact moment that an ABG is being drawn. But we also collect additional variables. This here is a screenshot of a worksheet that study coordinators use at bedside to collect data. We collect things such as ventilator settings, vasopressors, and paralytics. And we're hoping to do some secondary analysis once we begin to look at the data. I'll pass it over to Dr. Hendrickson now.
So in our first 5 months of data collection, we have identified some major challenges, as well as some observations that are going to guide the future directions of our research program. The major limitation we have in our study so far is that stable saturations of less than 90% are rare and treated expeditiously by clinicians who are at the bedside. So it's really hard to catch those data in that window. Additionally, I think all clinicians are familiar with the problem that the bedside oximeter can't pick up readings in all patients at all times. So we're trying to thoughtfully collect data about those instances when patients do not have a non-invasive reading for us to record, and also to think about how best to analyze those data. We've noted that there are variations in time from the ABG draw to the blood gas analyzer processing, as well as variability in how those samples are processed. And we have some really preliminary observations in a limited data set that suggests there could be differences across machines and also between different makes of blood gas analyzers. We'd like to set up more rigorous studies to look at both the time between draw and processing, the variability in how those samples are handled, and also the devices that produce the data we're analyzing. Notably, at SFGH, we use the GEM machines, and here at UCSF Health and in the hypoxia lab, we use the ABL90. So we're actually poised to make some of these comparisons within our group. I'm showing you here the first 86 patients we have enrolled with data from 206 ABGs. We feel that our population is representative of the population we serve at ZSFG, and we have a reasonable spread across skin pigment categories. Acknowledging the limitations of something like the Fitzpatrick scale, this just happens to be a convenient way for us to show you that we've got representation across a variety of skin pigment categories. Although I'm not suggesting this is the optimal way to analyze these data. And this last slide of our first 86 subjects is really to highlight that initial challenge I mentioned, where it's really hard to capture data of SATs less than 90%. You can see in this dot plot that we have good representation in the mid and high 90s, which you would expect because those are the SATs we target as clinicians. But we've got some limited data capture down at the lower numbers. In order to solve this problem, we need to hire more staff and additionally open a site here at UCSF Health. So we hope to see you all in the ICU in the near future. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isabella Auchus. I'm a fourth-year medical student here. And during my research time and time as with the UCSF year-long inquiry program, I've been working on projects with OpenOx for the past year and a half or so. So as mentioned earlier, inexpensive pulse oximeters have gained huge popularity recently, especially with COVID, and are widely available and commonly used to make clinical decisions, especially in resource variable regions and also in home care settings. However, the accuracy or performance of these devices is known to be variable, often unregulated and not fully characterized. So this is important because these low-cost devices are often the ones that are donated or procured in resource-limited areas. So because of this, we wanted to evaluate the accuracy of these lower cost bottles, especially in regards to how they perform with various skin pigments and under variable perfusion, and then also provide this performance data to inform the public. So what we did is we're testing some of the most commonly encountered and purchased fingertip and handheld devices in the market. So the way we selected these were selected with the goal of basically including the most commonly purchased and commonly used devices, with the majority of these being less than $60 US. And we selected them by getting input from ministries of health, global donors, global aid agencies, and looking also at which ones were most commonly purchased. So our goal is to really ensure that the devices that are being purchased for or by resource-limited areas are safe for clinical use. And below are just some photos of various oximeters that we have or are testing. So here's kind of our general setup for how we're doing these lab-based studies. We essentially set up patients on a partial rebreathing circuit and monitor and adjust their inspired gases, including oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, with the goal of achieving 10 to 12 stable SaO2 plateaus between 70 and 100%, and PaCO2 levels of 35 to 45. And this is really so we can establish stable plateaus at different levels of hypoxemia, so we can test devices at these varying levels. And since participants are breathing very quickly, we didn't want the CO2 level to go down and for them to get lightheaded. So that's kind of why we bleed CO2 into the circuit to keep a normal CO2 level. So we compare pulse oximeter readings, the SpO2, with arterial SaO2 on the blood gas analyzer to assess performance. And the way that we measure performance is using something called the ARMS. This stands for the average root mean square error. It's basically an established measure used by regulatory agencies to determine how accurately a pulse oximeter performs. It's essentially a statistical composite of accuracy and precision, and also includes the bias and standard deviation all into one value. But it's always a positive value, so it can't indicate whether SpO2 is negatively or positively biased for SaO2. And in order to meet FDA standards for pulse oximeters, devices need to have an ARMS of less than or equal to 3. And then skin pigment measurement is collected in the same way as described earlier, both subjective and objective measurements. So here's how we are sharing and disseminating our data. Like Greg mentioned, we plan to disseminate all of these findings and data on OpenAux, which is our consumer-facing open access website, as well as a research and development-facing raw data repository, which is in the works and hoping to launch this in the next couple of months. And again, here are some photos from our OpenAux and the study protocols, which are live on our website. So here's some preliminary data on fingertip oximeter performance, and just kind of an example of the range of performance that these devices can have. You can see here there are a few in green that do show acceptable performance of an ARMS of less than or equal to 3, but others, such as the ones in red, can be off by a lot, even over 5%. And we're actively testing more devices, about 12 more fingertip ones and 6 handhelds, all soon to be shared on OpenAux as well. So this slide and the next slide shows some preliminary skin pigment data and analyses from Drs. John Feiner and Leo Shmoilovich. Here's a plot showing basically 2 measures of skin pigment across participants. This is the inner upper arm site. So you see there's an objective measure, the ITA, which is the individual typology angle, versus the subjective measure, the Fitzpatrick. So you can see here that if Fitzpatrick was a more reliable scale, there shouldn't really be overlap between these colors that you see, other than basically under Fitzpatrick 6 is the only kind of separate one, but there's lots of overlap like 3 through 5. So you can see that different operators categorize patients at different Fitzpatricks, and there's a lot of room for subjectivity within this data. And recalling kind of what Greg said earlier, if the FDA require 2 subjects to have dark skin, first of all, that's up to interpretation if you consider, for example, 5 and 6 dark skin, but then also noticing that there's overlap with 3 through 5. So again, it makes a very big challenge for how we figure out skin pigment. And then the problem gets a little bit more complex when you actually look at these same measurements, but across different parts of the body. So these are all the various sites where we measure with our colorimeter device. And these are, again, plots with ITA versus Fitzpatrick, but on 9 different sites. And we can see that not all sites are equally as reliable and that there's high variability of Fitzpatrick scale types for a given ITA and vice versa, high variability of ITAs for a given Fitzpatrick. For our purposes, right now, we're more interested in where the pulse oximeter is placed, such as the nail, dorsal finger, palmar finger, but still a lot of variability across these sites and can vary depending on where we measure and light going through and all different things like that. And here are kind of our ongoing thoughts and plans. We plan to address that having the same accuracy or ARMS doesn't necessarily mean that devices are equivalent. For example, a $10 model likely doesn't have the same durability or lifetime cost or performance under variable perfusion or motion as a much higher cost device might. We're also trying to figure out, as mentioned, how to best use this objective and quantitative pigment data, such as what sites are best or most reliable, and doing so in collaboration with experts of other disciplines. We're also testing devices with varying perfusion and creating new protocols to replicate low perfusion states so we can test devices under those as well. And finally, what we're very excited about is just testing new potential regulatory changes. We're trying to improve lab-based studies so that they can better predict real-world performance in situations, which is really kind of the overarching goal of these studies and kind of what these studies are giving us insight into. Thank you.
With that, that's going to conclude the first half of the talks. While we're changing over to the next slides, I'll invite any questions that anybody has, and we'll also stick around for questions at the end. Thanks very much to all our speakers. A quick round of applause for them with our in-person audience. The question online is, how do you recruit patients and what barriers, if any, have you encountered in recruiting a diverse patient population? It's a great question. Does anybody want to? Happy to address it. It's a great question. Patient recruitment is a challenge and something that we're trying to better understand how we can improve. As Greg had mentioned, Dr. Okunlola is leading a pillar of the work which is exclusively focused on this issue of how do we ensure adequate diversity, not only in terms of the recruitment of our study subjects, but how we're defining diversity, what the impact of that diversity is on the findings, and then also just generally how we're interacting with the communities that this research impacts. And ensuring that we have adequate diversity in that interaction and communication. So I don't know that I could get into the details adequately in this amount of time, but right now we do advertise through a number of different forums and media, usually locally here in the Bay Area is how we're advertising. Often, as many in this room may attest to, frequently on campus here at the university and other campuses, other universities around town, but we are exploring partnerships with other organizations in the Bay Area to improve the diversity of our recruitment. And again, trying to work with them to explore how we can do this in a thoughtful way that maximizes the impact of the research. Thanks for that question. And then the other question here, as we're getting set up, is related to pediatric cardiac patients and whether or not that would be a suitable population given low saturations and arterial and venous lines. That's a great question. We have done studies with the pediatric cardiac population. In some ways, it's a great population for doing controlled studies in pediatrics for the reasons you pointed out, but it's also it presents a lot of challenges. There are physiologic differences, of course, in patients with congenital cardiac disease that makes some of what we're trying to study difficult, but it is a population of interest and one that we hope to expand work with in the near future, and one that the team at Stanford is doing some work with that we're collaborating on as well. So we'll pause there with the questions, but again, at the end, we're happy to come back to them. And for those that are keeping an eye on the Open Oximetry project, in the next few months, as alluded to, we'll be presenting a new web portal that will share the data from the project. So if you go to the site now, there are a handful of devices that we have results on, but we will be completely overhauling the site. There will be new data, and over the course of the next 12 months, we expect to be publishing data on a large number of devices and with extended testing protocols. So not what is currently there, which is the current regulatory frameworks, but data from expanded protocols that include some of the work that my colleagues have presented today on skin color quantification, perfusion, and more. So stay tuned. And now we'll try and change over here. If I could just get the screen changed back to the So for the final 30 minutes of today's talk, you're going to be hearing from Dr. Lundy Campbell, a man who needs no introduction, familiar to most who are here. Dr. Campbell has been a colleague and a mentor to me, but has also been a leader in cardiac anesthesia, critical care, and also has played a leading role in many global health programs here at UCSF and beyond, including several domestically and internationally during COVID. Dr. Campbell is going to speak today about his experience working with Doctors Without Borders, where he spent 3 months recently in South Sudan, and we look forward to hearing from that. So welcome. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks, Mike. Hello, everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I did, but not turn this into like what I did on my summer vacation kind of experience, and really just talk about some opportunities for global health, because this is kind of my pathway into global health. And I think that when I first got here, I was a resident and just concerned with learning anesthesia and didn't really understand like how could I even get involved with global health, or I wasn't a fellow through global health. And there are multiple paths, like everything, there's multiple pathways into this, right? And you can take as big of a bite as you want, or that can become bigger over time. And for me, it really did. And so I started really with a lot of, with some small in-country experiences, and then that kind of grew into some more other stuff, working with Mike and everything. And so it's been, it's becoming more of a passion for me as my career has gone on. And I just wanted to highlight a few things that I think either for anesthesiologists or for CRNAs, that there are ways to get into this without having to spend 3 months of your life in Africa or something like that. So, there's a lot of short assignments that you can provide in-country experience. And that's kind of where I started, really, either with, there's these various NGOs, Mercy ships out of UCSF. We have some leaders in Operation Rainbow. This is off of our webpage for the department. This is from Guatemala, and I've highlighted a couple of people from the department who are on this mission. These are generally about a week long. They're pretty easy to do, and they do get you involved in seeing kind of what global health is like in a medium to low resource setting. There's other ones like Operation Smile and stuff. Operation Rainbow is basically just orthopedics, but has an impact. When I first went on one of these, I was kind of thinking like, well, what impact do you have? But you actually have a pretty significant impact, not only on the person that you're working on, but also their entire family, because you can get people back to work, and it can really make a huge difference in generational poverty. And then there's longer assignments too. So MSF, ICRC, or the International Red Cross, which I'll talk a little bit about briefly, and then Emergency, which is kind of like the Italian MSF, much smaller, but they have some pretty significant projects going on. So, like I said, I'll talk a little bit about MSF at ICRC, a little about the history of how that kind of grew out. And then I can't really get into why people go to South Sudan, or why South Sudan is a big focus for both MSF and the International Red Cross, without talking a little bit about the history of it. So I'll mention that briefly, and then I'll finally wind up with some of my experience there. So MSF grew out of ICRC, and I'll talk about how that happened. But the Red Cross is kind of the the oldest organization of all this. It has been around for quite some time. Grew out of a major battle that happened during the Napoleonic Wars, where multiple war injury patients have, occurred, and so its focus is on armed conflict only, and healthcare is a very small portion of what they do. So they do a lot of, water and food security, mine clearing. They restore family. They have the ability to go into prisoner of war camps, make sure that see who's alive or not, and then get them in touch with their family. And it's a huge thing that they do. And then they do a lot of protection of the deceased as well, and register all these people. There's a amazing museum in Geneva about what they do. That's a lot kind of like the Holocaust Museum in many ways. It's phenomenal. There's some negatives about it though, because they have to they have an international mandate that they can go wherever they would need to, but they basically cannot, because of their neutrality, they cannot say what they see. They can't get back out and say, like, this atrocity was occurring when we were there. And MSF grew out of that because, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, but they provide independent, impartial medical and humanitarian assistance. So they are 100% medical. And so they go into armed conflict areas, but they also deal with epidemics and national disasters and malnutrition and everything else. So a little bit, they're similar, but they're somewhat different. And the way MSF was founded, it was in 1971. There was a small group of French physicians. Bernard Couchier was one of them. And it was in response to the Nigerian Biafran Civil War, where there was just mass genocide going on. And the French Red Cross required, working with the International Red Cross, required the volunteers to basically sign an agreement to preserve Red Cross neutrality. They couldn't speak up about what they were seeing. And these physicians said that amounts to a gag order, and they left and they started MSF in response to that. And one of MSF's, one of their big, things that they promote is speaking out. So their principles really are accessible medical care across all boundaries, regardless of race, creed, religion, or political affiliation. They remain neutral and impartial. They're independent. And when you give to MSF, you may say, I want to give to MSF to go to Ukraine. And they may say, okay, great. However, it might not. There's no strings attached when anybody gives money to MSF, and 90% of the money comes from private donors. So it really comes unattached. And they give the money where the need is. Now they provide security by having no weapons and being not a threat to anybody, even in an area where there's a lot of threat around them. These are the countries where currently where MSF has missions. This is in 2015. It's basically the exact same as today. They're pretty worldwide. You can see, like Red Cross, also mostly focused in Africa, and then a lot of the Middle East. But Africa seems to be the big point for most of them. So let me talk a little bit about the history of Sudan, because I think, like I said, I think that's important to understand why there's so much activity there. So really, Sudan was kind of managed by basically Britain and Egypt. And then eventually they turned in 1956, 55, 56, Sudan gained independence. It's a huge country. It's extremely diverse. As you see on the slides here, there's greater than 600 ethnic groups, over 400 languages spoken, and approximately the third of the size of the United States. So it's just incredibly, incredibly diverse. And when they founded it, they basically there were two big issues that led to its current problems. And the government was located in Khartoum up in the north. And there was no real protection of minority in the south. And the north and the south of Sudan are vastly different. Basically, the north occupies about 65% of the country, primarily Muslim, and basically the ethnicities are kind of mixed Arabic and African, But the southern region is basically ethnically African, and the religions are mostly Christian and animist. So drastically different countries, essentially, put within the same sphere. And we'll talk more about how that kind of led to the first civil war here. So as soon as the country was founded, it went into civil war. The South felt that they were not being adequately represented by the North. And this caused this very long civil war, as you see, almost 20 years, loss of about 500,000 lives, and of which 80% were civilians. So that's typical of most wars, right? Where when things are this bad that you get massive civilian casualties. Hundreds of thousands more were displaced. There was a lot of counterinsurgency tactics that the northern region used that left many southern people traumatized and deep distrust of their government. And they formed a fragile peace, but that really didn't last. And there was a second civil war in just a few years later in '82, which again went for over 20 years. And this really started because there was a rise in Islamic extremism in the north, and they declared all of Sudan to be an Islamic state, and which I already said, that the south is mostly Christian and animist. So that didn't go over so well. So the South formed their own basically army to fight against the North. This warfare became extremely violent. A lot of civilians were just specifically targeted. And the North used a lot of tactics to pit the Southern people. There's two main tribal groups, Dinka and Nuer, and they used tactics to split them and fight against each other. So all sides became progressively more ruthless. And as I said, the Dinka and Nuer are the two main ethnic groups within South Sudan, and they're basically, farmers and cattle raisers. And cattle is their is essentially their deep wealth, way more than money. So how many cattle you have is really a sign of like how much actual true wealth you have in that country. And that's important because in the Second Civil War, they did have an eventual peace agreement, but about 2 million people were killed during this time, and South was just economically destroyed, and over 6 million cows were destroyed. And so that just robbed them of their wealth during that time, which is why that's so important for them. And so these, like I said, these two groups were historically farmers and cattle grazers. Afterwards, there was poverty, there was rampant slavery, especially of young women, huge lack of education, children were used as soldiers, and there was massive refugees and displacement, with the two remaining big groups, Nika and Nuer, fighting for what limited resources were still available. So in July 1st, South Sudan becomes an independent state. And that was part of the agreement after that Second Civil War that South Sudan could govern themselves. But they formed this fragile peace between their government. The president was Dinka and the vice president was Nuer, and that quickly fell apart, and those two sides went into a civil war. And that in 2014, there was a huge massacre in the town of Bentu. When I saw what was the town of Bentu, it's amazing there was actually ever a town there. It's basically just completely leveled. There was another 400,000 dead, 4 million displaced, and 1.8 million were internally displaced, meaning they're still within South Sudan, but they're not living anywhere near their homes because they don't really exist. And then in 2017, it's even worse today, 6 million were facing starvation out of 11 million population. So over half the people are starving. And inflation is currently about 300%. And there's still no real peace yet. None of this I knew before I went there because, there's a lot in the media about Ukraine or something else, but who knows about South Sudan? I mean, it's just not known. It's crazy. It's the worst disaster going on in the world today. I mean, Yemen too, but this is probably, for the longer time, this is the worst. And what are the demographics of all this? So if you look at the United States, right, we have this is on the left, this is kind of what, like first world countries look like, right? Where basically everybody lives until they get to about 70 or 80, and then they slowly start dying off. But in really bad areas like South Sudan on the right, you can see that there's a very high birth rate. And by age 5, most of them or a lot of them have died. In many places in South Sudan, they don't even name kids for the first few years of their life because there's no need. Most of them are not going to survive, so they don't even bother. So this is where MSF has activities in South Sudan, which is basically everywhere. And Bentu project is basically one of the largest in the country. And as you can see, it's up in the north. Juba is the capital where you fly into. Bentu is what's called a protection of civilian camp. It was established in 2014 after this big Bentu massacre that I talked about. The town is basically just gone. Initially, there was about 440 to 50,000 people in it. Now there's about 120 to 150,000 people in this camp. It's just massive. It is the largest refugee camp in South Sudan. And MSF has opened and then continuously run a hospital there since 2014. It's the only medical center within that area. Violence and stuff is still ongoing, right? There's still a lot of sexual and gender-based violence that goes on in here. And it's kind of a disaster. Here is what the camp looks like. It is sitting in the middle of this great swamp called the Sud. It's worse now, this is just from this year, because of global warming and because they've had this massive flood. But it floods all the time. The camp sits below the level of water because it's surrounded by this big dike. I'll show you some more pictures of where, so if you take that and then I look at it straight ahead, on the left over there is kind of this where the UN has some stuff and where the MSF hospital is, and then all around it is all the camp. And if you just kind of focus in, going in, that's the hospital in the green. So not much around you, nowhere to go. And then you're just surrounded by this camp that you work within. The camp looks like, on the ground, that's basically what it looks like. And there is one of the dikes, which they have kind of a road walkway that kind of surrounds this area. The hospital itself, this is looking straight down the hospital, which was initially all tents, but has kind of become a little more fabricated buildings. It's about a 120-bed hospital, but just like UCSF, we run above capacity, 150 to 180 patients at all times. They kind of do everything: obstetrics, pediatrics, adult medical, adult surgical, pediatric surgical. I'm going to show you a video next, which was filmed a couple of years ago. It's an MSF video from Bentu, and basically everybody in that they interview on here are still working there, and I work with all these people. These are all people that live in the camp that are employed by MSF to work within the hospital.
So we are living in POC now. We are not happy to live there, but it is a situation forced us to go. We don't want it to happen again, that there should be a camp like this. We hope in our future we don't want our children to stay in this place. We want to change our life now so that our children cannot stay like this in this difficult life.
Our hope in the future time is everybody will go and to his home or her home. So everybody will go and get through the system. Study. You will not get worried for your family that you left behind, or
1 second.
If there will be a stability in United States, even there will be some a school here, so whereby everything will be forgotten.
Even though there is no fighting taking place, but people are still dying in the village, in the towns, insecurity is still there. I cannot go out now and do other activities. I have to be killed. That is why I'm in POC at the moment. 2015, the scientists, everyone was happy. It fails. This one now, we don't have hope that this peace will just come soon. For us, it seemed like it will take time, something like 10 years coming, or more than that.
When I'm not working, I have nothing to enjoy because I'm not happy about my country. I've already taken my children to another country because I also want to give them a good education. They are now in Uganda. The only thing I want to happen is to have a peace. And when the crisis of this country is finished, I have to bring them back. And then we say together, we have to enjoy everything.
We need help in South Sudan, and because now it's two things. Conflict already finished people, many people die, and also the diseases are also killing people. So these two together, when you combine it, we are losing many people in the country. My message is to international community is to help also the government of South Sudan to achieve this peace and also intervene in some areas where the people need help a lot. Specifically, I may talk of HIV. This one, you need more intervention from international community with collaboration with Ministry of Health and the government of South Sudan. I know one hand cannot clap itself, so we can only do that if we have support. It has been 7 years now in conflict. Some majority of the population are in exile. People are in POC. If the family members are scattered, like my family, immediate family, they are not here. They are not in South Sudan now. They flee to Kenya. But we did not lose hope. We still have that hope that people will agree and understand and welcome back each other and then live as a community the way we did before.
So the cases that we basically that you see there, a lot of malnutrition, dehydration, infectious disease is rampant. So you see malaria, tuberculosis everywhere, HIV, COVID, leprosy, cholera, Hep E, various other tropical diseases, a lot of diabetes, a lot of sexual and gender-based violence issues to women and children. And then we also had some abductions and beatings of even torture of some of our medical staff who were, people come through the camp every so often and take kids for future warfare potentially, and they would just abduct them out of the camp. So the camp is very dangerous. And then a couple of the staff were abducted. Briefly, one was tortured pretty badly. The other guy was beaten up pretty horribly, so that's, as they were saying in the video, it's unsafe even in the camp, and that most of the people, as you saw, had their kids, if they could afford it, they sent their kids elsewhere, Uganda, Kenya. They had not seen their family in 5 years, so it's just they want peace so they can bring their family back. Surgical cases, we did a fair amount of stuff. So a lot of burns, trauma, both penetrating and blunt, a lot of snake bites. There's a lot of poisonous snakes in South Sudan. Abscesses, tropical ulcers, you can see kind of the whole range of stuff. This is a sigmoid volvulus that a patient came in and that we did an entire colectomy on. And then we had a fair amount of burns. Kids get burned badly. This little 5-year-old boy who I didn't think was going to make it for a long time, but did survive after, he just came in horribly malnourished. We were able to get his nutrition better, but he's going to be badly disfigured. He's had multiple skin grafts. Most of them fail. But it's they cook over open fires, and then the kids will fall into them and get horribly burned. Had a child with a 18-month-old kid came in with a Wilms tumor. This is his kidney. It took a long time to get this kid to us. We had to fly him from a different place. Unfortunately, he died on post-operative day number 3 because his remaining kidney went into renal failure. there's really not much you can do beyond, and which I'll talk about a little bit, beyond just the straightforward OR care that you give. And you'll see we saw a lot of neglected wounds. So you've got some type of squamous cell tumor on the left of this patient that came in. This is how he presented. It's a patient on the right who came in with a gunshot wound to the knee. That's what's left of his knee. After, and patients will frequently come in quite late, present late, because it takes them a long time to get to the hospital if they don't live right in the camp. They may have to come by boat, canoe, essentially. And so this took him, a week to get there, and this whole leg. We had to remove his leg, of course. You have some oddball things. This patient comes in with a recurrent lymphoid tumor that we had been, apparently she had other tumors that had been taken off over the time. This one was particularly pretty disfiguring. The surgical cases, there was a lot of cases we were not able to perform anything elective, neurologic, or cardiothoracic, because we don't have ventilators, and there's no ICU or no high dependency unit level of care, no dialysis, no continuous infusions. That's the anesthesia setup right there. You're looking at the Diametica draw-over anesthesia system. It's the thing's a workhorse. It's extremely simple, so therefore nothing breaks on it. And that's the extent of your monitoring. So that's kind of state of the art for Ben 2. So if I looked at like what was available, I had, single lead ECG and non-invasive blood pressure sat, and end-tidal CO2, which is surprising. Had some epinephrine, halothane, and atracurium. I had a few LMAs, and I had a HemoQ and a glucometer, but I didn't have, which I would have loved to have had, some end-tidal gas monitoring, some way to warm a patient. Didn't have a video laryngoscope, don't really need that. Central line would have been nice. Suxamethonium or anything like that would have been good. Didn't have it. Beta blockers or inotropes other than epinephrine, and no other way to measure anything else. So it was a little bit challenging. I had 2 patients that came in badly injured. One was a stab wound that took him 3 days to get to the hospital. I couldn't measure blood pressure when he came into the hospital. And there was, he was profoundly septic. The exact next night, I had another patient who came in with a high velocity wound through and through his belly, probably with an AK-47. He also was profoundly septic. And, I don't even know who knows what their blood gas was. Both those patients died. We got them off the table, but again, there's no ICU, there's no ventilator. You have to just make it at the end of the case like that. So that baby with the Wilms tumor and those 2 patients all died in 3 successive days. That was about the low point of my mission. It was just really hard to feel like you feel like you could do more, but you just can't. I'll finish with this. Basically, this is my favorite patient, and this was at not the height of my beard growing, but I did get a little bit worse than that, and then I finally decided it had to go. This was a 20-year-old guy who was basically got up at night and go to the latrine, lived out in the camp, and he was stabbed with a spear and robbed. He came in, he was really, really, really sick. Our surgeon had just been diagnosed with COVID. There's one surgeon, one anesthesiologist, that's it. So you're on 24 hours a day for 7 days a week, obviously for 3 months. And so unfortunately the surgeon got COVID. And so then he was really sick, but he decided he could operate on this guy. I've never seen anybody more miserable in my life than that surgeon during that case. And then he left for 10 days. I nursed this guy back to health on the ward. And this is the day when he left, he just came up, we were discharging him, he gave me a big hug before he left. And he was really grateful. Surprisingly, he did well. It was a little bit worrisome when the surgeon left. I had a guy who was stabbed to the chest, had to deal with that. A guy who was stabbed to the neck, and I had to deal with that. And both of them actually did well, but it's just, it's pretty basic. And then, living conditions, not so great. So this is where you live. It's what it's like when it rains. Those there in the rainy season. This is the latrines. In the hot time, those things are pretty miserable. 40 degrees outside, 40 degrees centigrade outside, probably 50 degrees on the inside, pretty terrible. I'll end there and take any questions if anybody has any.
Lundy, what was the recruitment process like?
So both of them, both ICRC and MSF have kind of a very similar process. You can look online and see when they are actually accepting positions. Being an American is the worst thing you can possibly be for both organizations, and non-French speaking. So I ticked both those boxes, still got a job with them, but it's hard to get, shocking. Americans are not welcome throughout the world. So they like people that have other nationalities in their passports. And both of them are kind of French. And so they really want you to be able to speak French. But you can get by without it. But basically you look on their website and it'll say like, okay, we're accepting applications for an anesthetist, and then you can apply that way, or for a CRNA or something like that. And so you put your application in. It's a long process. You go through a lot of interviews and everything. MSF was faster than ICRC. ICRC, I'm still waiting to hear if I'm going to get an assignment with them, but I should within the next year. But they get backlogged. But they'll open the recruitment up. You just have to watch, and then once it opens up, get your fired off an application and get it in, and then you'll get in the pool. Yeah.
Well, with that, we'll conclude. I want to thank all the speakers today. Also want to special thank you to Phil Bickler, who leads the Hypoxia Lab, for support of the Open Oximetry project, John Feiner for not retiring quite yet to help with the project as well, and then to Michael Gropper and Romain Paraccio for their continued support of global health equity faculty, fellows, and our programs that have allowed us to grow over the years. So with that, have a good day, everyone. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks.